The Far Quest, The Chronicles of Cursoon, Book 1, by R. Jason Lynch. Chapter 28, Night Sickness. Cursoon and Tipplglee made it back into the Great Hall just as the sun was disappearing beyond the western horizon. The old gnome quickly built a fire upon the massive hearth in the midst of the huge room, and there the bard prepared their evening meal. After setting right one of the long, lordly tables, the two weary travelers found a couple of unbroken chairs and sat down to eat. During their wordless dinner, Tipplglee took out his flask and found it just as empty as before. This only served to darken his mood even further. Once they had finished eating, Cursoon bade his grumpy friend good night with a forced smile, and then excused himself from the table. It was not long before he was back in the Lord's bedchamber, falling into its finely cushioned feather mattress. Because the bard was so tired, he did not even bother to take off his clothes. However, when the bed caught Cursoon, the force of his fall produced a billowing dust cloud that filled the room. After much coughing and sneezing, he recovered, and then, once the dust settled, he shrugged off the filthiness of the bedchamber. Pulling his colorful hat down over his eyes, he sighed with pleasure because of the bed's softness and sleepily remarked,
"It couldn't be any dirtier than the hard ground upon which I've been sleeping these last 6 months. But oh, how much softer."
With that, he was soon fast asleep, and how wonderful was that slumber. In fact, he slept so well that he even had a dream. At the same time, Tipplglee still sat in the great hall, and he felt utterly miserable. He could have brewed some of Cursoon's tea, which he knew would help, but what he really wanted was locked away in the flooded wine cellar.
"So close, and yet just out of my reach,"
he grumbled to himself. After licking his dry lips, the old gnome shoved his chair away from the table, and then, with a heavy sigh, he made his way to the servants' bedchambers. Since they had not searched all of these rooms earlier, Tipplglee looked into each one to see which had the more comfortable bed, but when he opened the last door at the end of the hall, his spirit lifted a little.
"This must be the steward's chamber,"
he remarked to himself as he glanced around the larger room. The bed in this chamber was slightly wider. There was a tiny wood stove in a corner, and a small writing desk with a matching stool. The room even had a small window within an arched alcove. With all that, it was the ring of iron keys hanging upon a hook that made a quick grin part the gnome's mustache from his beard. However, the smile was gone before anyone could notice it. Hastily snatching the key ring from its hook, Tipplglee hurried to the wine cellar's locked door. The sound of the jingling keys echoed down the corridor as he tried every one in the lock. When the last key opened the door with a metallic screech, the old gnome breathed a sigh of relief. Thus, Tipplglee stayed up late into the night, greedily gathering and counting the casks of wine he found floating in the cellar. By the time he stumbled back to the steward's room, he was far from sober, and thus he collapsed into the bed, snoring loudly almost before his head had even hit the pillow. As Tipplglee passed out, Cursoon suddenly awoke and struggled to climb out of the dusty feather mattress. While fighting back a fit of coughing and sneezing, he hurried over to his pack, quickly took out his quill, a bottle of ink, and his herbal journal. Finding an empty page by the light of the fireplace, he dipped his quill in the ink and began to scribble in short, rapid strokes. Hastily, he drew the strange vessel he had seen in his dream, for he feared that the memory of it might quickly slip from his mind. Once Cursoon had successfully captured its design, he gave the sketch an approving nod. Then, after letting the ink dry for a moment, he carefully closed the book and laid it upon the mantel. Moving to return to bed, he suddenly froze as a gust of wind from the open balcony doors blew in and snuffed out the flames in the fireplace. In that moment, a soft, breathy voice spoke.
"Adiksha."
With a start, Cursoon leapt back into the bed and quickly covered his head with the dusty blankets. Fighting back a cough, he lay as still as he could like a child hiding from some imagined monster. Though the blankets were warm, the bard began to shiver violently. Before the sun rose, Tippleglee awoke with a groan. Staggering out of bed, he sighed and squinted his hazel-green eyes. Rubbing his smooth, bright white, bald head, he moaned with pain.
Ugh,
Tippleglee grumbled.
it's plain enough. A pillow puck's been hammering upon my pate this night.
Feeling for his wooden-framed spectacles, he set them on his long nose and shuffled into the great hall. Silently, he prepared and ate his breakfast. Wordlessly, he loaded supplies into their boat, and still Cursoon had not come down from the Lord's chamber. While he greatly enjoyed the quiet morning, he secretly started to worry. He was sure something had to be wrong for the talkative bard to miss a chance to chatter away in his pointed ears. Still, the grumpy little man tried to be patient, but it was a hard thing for him. He was, after all, a gnome. Once an hour had slipped by, he could take no more, and so he went to find out why the bard was causing such a delay. Grumbling, the little man climbed the wide staircase, passed through the council room, went up the winding stair to the parlor. Passing through that room, he walked down the short hallway and threw open the door to the Lord's bedchamber. All the while, his grumbling grew louder with every step. When at last he found the fool bard still in bed, Tippleglee was ready to give him a piece of his mind.
It's plain to see how comfortable you are.
He growled loudly.
But your fool's errand won't accomplish itself.
Cursoon said nothing, but only a weak moan issued forth from within the mountain of blankets. The grumpy old gnome yanked back the covers, only to find the bard's feet.
Why are you upside down?
Tippleglee grumbled with a puzzled expression. Next, the little man pulled back the blankets at the foot of the bed, and so he found the bard's head, but Cursoon did not open his eyes. Instead, he only murmured,
Cursed. I'm cursed.
With a grim look, Tippleglee put his bony hand upon the trembling bard's brow and noted that he was very feverish.
What ails you, lad?
Tippleglee asked with uncharacteristic gentleness. Cursoon was shivering and deathly pale. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his lips were a sickly gray hue. Though the gnome hated to admit it, he had seen these symptoms before. With a furrowed brow, Tippleglee gently shook the bard, and after a few attempts, he finally managed to rouse him a little.
Mr. Tippleglee?
Cursoon mumbled in a quivering voice as he gazed with blurred eyes at the little man.
Could you brew me a tea from jar 7?
For a moment, the old gnome had no idea what the bard was talking about, but then he remembered the numerical system Cursoon had devised to organize his herbal jars. With a nod, Tippleglee went to the younger man's pack and found the jar marked with the number 7, but there was little more than a pinch inside.
Wasn't it 7 pinches you needed?
He asked.
There's not but 1 in your jar. Will it be enough?
Cursoon shook his head weakly.
Is your knowledge of herbal lore enough? Enough to find what I need?
Tippleglee lifted his chin smugly.
I'm a gnome, and we gnomes make it our business to know what grows in our forests.
Cursoon smiled faintly.
In my book.
He whispered and gestured over the gnome's shoulder.
Number 7. There's a list of the herbs needed.
Wasting no time, Tippleglee snatched up the bard's book and flipped through its pages. Finding brew number 7, he read the ingredients aloud.
7. Penitent tea. 1 humble root ground into a powder. 7 way-turning stems broken into small pieces. And a handful of healer's hope petals.
With a frown, the old gnome admitted.
I'm sorry, lad, but I've never heard of any of these plants.
Cursoon nodded.
It's all right. That's why I drew them. Just in case the reader calls them by other names.
Tippleglee turned to the next page, and there he found each plant drawn and its name written beside its picture.
I may not know your names, but I know the plants well enough,
Tippleglee declared proudly. With that, he rushed out of the Lord's chamber and down to his leaf-shaped boat. As he paddled from one island to the next, he did not seem to be searching, but instead, it was as though he knew just where each of the plants grew. Thus, it was not long before he had dug up a brown, fist-sized root, cut 7 of the prickly briars, and gathered a handful of the small white flowers. Returning to Cursoon as quickly as he could paddle, he brewed the tea and gave it to the bard to drink. Though it was more proper to dry the ingredients first, the tea still seemed to work, for not long after drinking it, Cursoon stopped shivering and began to rest more peacefully. Tippleglee's thoughts drifted to the time when he had seen a similar illness. It was while he still served Sir Beset, the Lord of Blackthorn. The old knight was often sick, with nearly the same symptoms, and had died after the last bout, but Beset had never taken tea or any other remedy to ease his ill health.
Perhaps he'd have fared better with such treatments,
Tippleglee muttered to himself.
I had a dream.
Cursoon suddenly whispered, waking the gnome from his thoughts.
I drew what I saw. It might help us. Will you have a look at it?
Tippleglee nodded.
Aye, lad, I'll have a look.
Thank you, my dear Mr. Tippleglee.
The bard muttered as he drifted back to sleep. Tippleglee was happy to have something to occupy his mind and hands, for gnomes cannot abide idleness. Thus he gladly studied the last drawing in the bard's book. It was not long before the old gnome was off with his axe in hand, searching for a tree that was no longer living, but free of rot.